Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Revere End podcast. My name is Alfie and today I'm joined yet again by my co-host Billy Dunform. Billy, how are you doing today, mate?
Yeah, good. A bit tired. You can probably tell by my change of surroundings, which I do want to assure everyone is not Ben Ambrose's conservatory, because we did have that sort of like worry, and he moved house on Sunday. So I did manage to get a couple of hours on the sofa just to watch, unfortunately, maybe watch Norwich's performance. Probably should have carried on packing, but no, I'm glad to be back talking about Norwich and not sort of, trying to do flat pack furniture and stuff. But it should be good.
Lovely. We are also, as you can probably tell, we are also joined by a guest, and the first guest for our YouTube, recorded versions of our podcast. And that's Connor Southwell from the Archant and the PinkUn, or EDP. I mean, you kind of do the rounds, right? How are you doing today, Connor? How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm okay. I don't know if I should, if I'm going to put people off being your first recorded guest with this mug, but I'll take it as a compliment. No, I'm good. It's been a very, as I'm sure we'll get onto, a very hectic 24 hours or so. I'll give you a nice metaphor to start with. So I was in my hotel in Bournemouth this morning after watching Norwich City. I opened my curtains and had a nice view of the sea just above the horizon, and the waters were calm. And I just thought, I bet Daniel Farker wishes that the sort of waters at Norwich City were as calm as that, because it certainly feels all over the place. So there you go. You can have that one for free.
Well played. I guess before we kind of go into it, I just wanted to ask, like, obviously it's been we've kind of connected a couple of times. More recently, obviously Billy's come on to the Terrace Talk, but before that we've been on two separate Terrace Talks, I believe, was it two? Earlier on in the year, I guess, back when there was normal times. But how's the kind of first year been for you? Obviously switching from, I guess, more like YouTube kind of content to the Arch, and how's that been like for you?
Good. Yeah, it's been it's not been a great, obviously, season to cover, which is part of it, but I've loved every second. And again, it's been just weird for a number of reasons. Of course, walking into a new job and sort of getting acclimatized to that, then suddenly you have a global pandemic, the likes of which we haven't seen for 100 years, and there's all sorts of concerns and ramifications to that, and then there's of course adapting to new surroundings as well. So there were a lot of challenges in that first year. I'm hoping the second year will be a bit more plain sailing, but it's been good. It's not been an easy transition at times, to be completely honest, but I've luckily had people with a lot of patience. I work with some great people, and I've really loved sort of following Norwich up and down the country. Usually watching them get beat, but it's a dream, really. It's my dream job. I found the whole thing very surreal, and I think it's only really sort of sunk in probably since the start of this season now, that this is sort of what I do. So it's still bizarre, but yeah, I love every second of it.
One question I do want to briefly ask before we kind of talk about Bournemouth, and I guess this is, as we speak about kind of like the new times and whatnot, you found yourself obviously in the stadium, and we know Bournemouth Stadium is small anyway, so there probably wasn't a lot of people in there regardless. But and again, you might not, but do you ever find that, because obviously you're the only person really in there, or one of the only people in there, do you find like yourself like shouting for calls or vocally being like, oh, come on, ref? That's a foul, mate. Do you ever see yourself doing that?
Well, when you're as professional as me, these things don't. No, of course you do. Yeah, of course you do. There was obviously a couple of penalty appeals on Sunday that you kind of sort of find yourself, saying ref, but you have to kind of be measured, and I kind of take, in a weird way, you kind of, because look, it's horrible to be honest, to be in a stadium without any fans, and anyone who's been to a behind closed doors game will tell you exactly the same. It's not football. It's not the same. It kind of to me has felt more like I'm going to do a job rather than I'm going to watch a game of football, which has been a real shame. And like we all go to football, play football, watch football for the fans, right? So without it does feel a little bit bland and a bit pointless, to be completely frank. And just as we felt there was a step back towards a life where fans were going to be let back in, suddenly that gets snatched away again. So it's a very weird environment to be in, very safe, obviously, and it's going to be it's going to be weird when fans do come back in sort of mass numbers that we saw before, because it's going to be such a change. And if that happens halfway through a season, then that's going to be quite a shift for the players to have to acclimatise to. But it's quite the only benefit of it really is that you're, particularly in a ground like Bournemouth, you're really close to the action. You get to hear the managers raw, unedited, which you don't usually get to hear in a full stadium, and you get to hear the players as well. So you realise, like, it was only on Sunday at Bournemouth, you realise quite how vocal Tim Krul is, or Max Aarons, and how demanding they are as well, and how high standards they set, which again doesn't necessarily come across on the stream as well. So it's useful in terms of little snippets like that, but in terms of as a spectacle, as an environment, in terms of the drama of it, like you get to the 87th minute and it doesn't really feel like Norwich is chasing an equaliser. It's kind of, there's no tension or passion in it at all, really. And I think it does affect players as well. But you do find yourselves calling for things. Some members of the media are more vocal than others, and don't press me as to who, but that's certainly the case. But yeah, it's kind of football for the foreseeable future, sadly, and it's something that we've had to acclimatise to. And I hope, and I think we've probably acclimatised to it better than can be said of the Norwich City players.
No, well, I guess what I wanted to say is that it would be a little bit easier, as you mentioned, if the performances on the pitch were to a certain standard, let's just say. And I suppose that's probably the best kind of point where we can start off. And I'll kind of open up the floor and say, whoever wants to kind of take the lead on this one. But what went wrong at Bournemouth?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one, because I'm sure we'll get on to like the extenuating circumstances later. And the Farkas sort of gave his reasons as to why the two players in question were omitted from selection. But to me, it almost felt like his hands were tied, or say like he'd had the week to prepare using a certain system with certain personnel, and then all of a sudden those players aren't available. Norwich's decision, or Farkas' decision, to suddenly switch to a very, in my opinion, regressive 4-1-4-1 system after such sort of they weren't pleasing performances, but we'd had 4 points from 2 games using 4-2-3-1, a system which historically has been used under Farkas. So for me, with Dowell out, obviously, and then with Emmy and Todd not being selected, it felt like Lucas Rupp was probably the next best option, and Lucas Rupp can't play in a 10, so we'll play a 4-1-4-1. And as soon as Bournemouth scored, they sat back and Norwich's pace out wide, which was their only attacking threat in terms of creativity, because you had a defensive midfielder and 2, I would say, destructive ball-winning midfielders to some extent. Bear in mind, it felt like then Norwich's sort of attacking threat wasn't there because there was no space to exploit. That would be sort of like my rough summary of it. I'm not sure. Connor was there as well. I think we've already discussed, so he'll probably be able to give a little bit more of an indication of sort of the feeling in the ground, I suppose. But that was certainly my sort of view on it. I'm not sure if you'd agree.
I get the frustration. I'm probably I've kind of been shocked at how much more positive I've been about the performance overall than perhaps a lot of Norwich fans. And I don't know if that's because kind of Norwich fans have already, like at the start of the afternoon, before a whistle was kicked, they started off a place that was quite angry, and I don't know if that's a continuation of that and maybe emotions taking over. But for me, particularly the second half, I felt was probably the best half of football we've seen this season. And I take into account the lack of creativity and the final third confusion. But again, these are the reasons why I look at it slightly positively. They're 3 games in. They only won 1 of their opening 6 when they won the championship title. For me, at this moment in time, it's more about patterns of play than results. And I think this is a time really, of course, if you get the performances right, the results will follow. And for me, to go to an AFC Bournemouth side who are very well set up, very well drilled, defensively very organised, a side that came down in the Premier League after spending a significant period of time there, with all the quality they have on show, to go there and to dominate the ball. And again, you can argue about whether they did or didn't do anything about it. To dominate the ball in the way that they did, it was much more reminiscent to me of a Daniel Farkas side than perhaps we've seen against Preston and against Huddersfield as well. And it's easy to analyse things based on the scoreline, but I think you have to delve a bit deeper. And again, I take the final third frustrations completely, because Placetta's positioning wasn't great. He did take the runs of other people. Quintilla did have too deep a starting position. These are minor things, and when they are so subtle and so minor, but there's a lot of them, they are quite major across a team. But the fact they went to a side that I think will be near the top of the league come May, dominated the ball, that's key for confidence. They haven't dominated the ball in the way that we saw against Bournemouth for a long time. And actually, I look at that group at the moment and think they just need an injection of confidence. And you get that by having a lot of the ball. And at the moment, you're seeing them sort of pass opportunities to play the passes that probably unlock a defence. With confidence, they will do that. So that's why I've kind of taken a different view, and maybe, again, it's about, you have to look at the bigger picture. But I totally get the frustrations completely that people have. Sorry, jump in. Feel free.
No. I think what is probably evident is who's the professional here and who's now classified as the fan. I'm sure you still class yourself as a fan, but I'm probably, and Alfie's probably included, it's a little bit maybe more difficult to just focus on the 90 minutes at the moment, or not at the moment, but the last few days. I get the point. I think it is bizarre. Well, it was bizarre in those first two games watching Norwich not necessarily dominate the ball. And I completely get sort of that scenario that you could say they improved on against Bournemouth. I'm not too sure if Bournemouth have really dominated possession thus far under Jason Tindall. I think I read that they had sort of less than like 50% of all their games. So I suppose time will tell, as opposed to whether that was Norwich's maybe proactivity in terms of trying to dominate the game, or if it was just Bournemouth being happy to sit back because ultimately if they're not going to pressure, then you are going to have the ball. But no, I think that's a very fair point, and I'd be inclined to agree with some of the points made for sure.
I think I kind of would sit somewhere in the middle of both of those points, in the way that
always on the fence.
Hey, you got to be right. I think the way I see it is, I will absolutely agree that we looked so much more comfortable in possession, and I think the midfield three of McLean and you know what, for someone who usually I not necessarily give stick to, but kind of look through in Lucas Roop, I must say I thought he probably had his best game in Norwich shirt, and I think there was a lot of unnecessary stick towards him, when I think that if there was anyone in that midfield three that should be getting any kind of scrutiny, it would be Kenny McLean, in my opinion. I did just want to kind of highlight how well I thought Oliver Skipp did, and kind of how integral he can be to that midfield, even more so than what we've seen in the first couple of games. I think there was a couple of times late on where he'd pick up the ball and almost kind of play that role where he sits in between the two centre halves and kind of takes the ball forward into their half. And he was spraying some lovely balls out towards Max Aarons on that right-hand side. And it looked like a real nice kind of, not partnership because they're two opposite kind of places on the pitch, but as kind of an outlet for the future. If you've got someone like that making those runs, Oliver Skipp's got the quality to kind of pick him out. I do feel a little bit sorry for Pookie, in the way that I just feel like it was a game set up for him to fail. I didn't really think that there wasn't no spaces for him to run into. And I feel like any kind of chance we had, the ball was just going to be flashed across the face of goal, which most of the time was in the air. And he's not that kind of striker. It was almost more kind of coped towards Jordan Hugill, to be honest with you. And I don't really think that he was going to be seeing much game time until like the 88th or whatever minute. But I think it's just one of those ones where we don't know the full story of how late into the week this decision was made to not play Emmy and Todd. And if it was late in the week, I can kind of sympathize a bit with him, because it did look like a team that wasn't really like the sole focus, if that's the right kind of term to use. But no, I would say the main highlights I have from that is that Oliver Skipp looks like a fantastic acquisition again. And I think that Lucas Roop played a really, really great game as well in midfield.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think Rook for me was probably the standout, slightly edged on Skipp for me. But Ollie Skipp's a terrific player, a really, really good player. And I know that they are super excited about him inside the walls at Colney as well. So he seems to back that up. And it was also interesting it was always going to be interesting to see his response to his Preston performance, which I didn't think was as good. And for me, yesterday probably did his Huddersfield one as well. So it's good signs for him. It's about consistency. There's still some rawness to his game, I think, positionally, and he's so eager. He wants to go and press players, and sometimes that makes him a little bit easy to bypass. But look, these are all minor things that will be worked on, and Daniel Farke will help him improve on. But he looks splendid, to be honest. And in terms of that midfield, I get it, and because and I made this point on sort of our PinkUn podcast earlier, we've kind of gone from 2 years ago or even a year ago saying, well, Daniel Farke's got too many technical players, to now saying maybe he hasn't got enough. And it is a midfield that has been a sort of transition from being a midfield based on possession and retaining the ball and progressing the ball to one that's very functional and one that is very mobile and energetic and is about supporting phases of play rather than perhaps being the protagonists, as Daniel Farke likes to call them, that want to get the foot on the ball and to play and to dictate and to assert Norwich City's desired philosophy onto their opponents. So that is a shift, and I think that probably is a tweak that we've seen from or maybe that's the scarring from the Premier League that we're seeing and just how much difficulty they had in that particular area. But as much as we talk about a lack of creativity, for me, you have to praise Bournemouth and their defensive shape, because they were so structured and they did make it hard and they did condense space, and it was a very firm low block, and it was like Norwich hit the final third and suddenly they had a brick wall to try and play through, and they tried going through it with Jordan Hugill, and I think if he was on a bit longer, and you're right, at 60 minutes I was kind of thinking, well, this game's suited to Jordan Hugill really for the reasons that you said about the crossing. Whether that was purposeful or not, I'm not quite sure, but on the evidence of the opening three fixtures, it certainly suggests that Norwich are certainly keen to get more crosses into the box. Well, that's all very well and good, but that in that case, you cannot have Teemu Pukki as a lone striker. You need either someone alongside him, or for me, the way it is heading, which is maybe Teemu Pukki playing off an Adam Eder or a Jordan Hugill, if that's the way you want to go about it, because you can't suddenly tell a striker who feeds on finding space and running in behind and making intellectual movements that he's now a target man. That doesn't work. And again, these are kind of things that I'm interested to see in sort of upcoming weeks. Is that a teething issue and new players just kind of adapting to the style and adapting to their other players, or is that something that's come from the head coach? And I think really you can only sort of see that over a 10-game period before we can sort of really identify trends and perhaps sort of tactical ideas that are coming through. So there's lots of interesting elements, which again is probably why I'm keen to give them a little bit more time, so to speak. We are only 3 games in, and it's like turning around sort of the Titanic, I guess, in terms of that mentality shift, and 11 players or not is going to be incredibly difficult to do, and even harder, as I'm sure we'll come on to, when the uncertainty with the transfer window persists.
Well, I guess speaking about kind of turning like a Titanic, I guess that's probably the only way I'm gonna go from it. I'd like to talk about I'd like to go on about that, just the only goal in the game. Now, I think it was very clear from the off that Danjuma, he looked like he was going to cause some issues. And I'd just like to get your opinion on, and it might, we speak about this quite a lot with Christoph Zimmermann, because it's like a love-hate relationship. He's done so much, and he's like this people's hero. You know, he come from the 4th division, and everyone was like, "Who?" when we first signed him. And the problem is that I feel like with the start of the season, we've kind of vocally said about his distribution problems he's got, and he's very good aerial, or aerially, should I say? But I feel like the way that the Bournemouth were going to play and going to set up was, at any given time, get Danjuma on Christoph Zimmermann, because if he does that little flick like he does normally, or like he did for the goal, you could see Zimmermann, he was scrambling for his life. And I feel like, can you fault him for that? Was that his fault? Was that the way, could Godfrey be in a position where he shouldn't allow Danjuma to go across to Zimmermann? What's your thoughts on the goal?
It's in terms of Danjuma's influence, it's a piece of magic, really. That's what you need in the Championship, and he's going to be a player for me that causes teams a lot of problems. I mean, you've got to remember they signed him for 14 million. So there's definitely a player there, still only 23. But yeah, the turning circle of Zimbo isn't great, and maybe I'm being polite. I also think he probably got caught a little bit too tight. He allows him to create the space with his touch, and again, I think you could probably extend criticism onto maybe Ollie Skip positionally, because that is an area that he should be screening. And essentially, as a defensive midfielder, you need to screen sort of the space in between your centre backs, so that ball doesn't get played in and you don't get turned, which is exactly what happened. I kind of feel with Christoph Zimmermann that he is a player with obviously great intangible qualities, his leadership, his presence, again, his physicality as well. But I think he's one of the players, like I said at the top end of the show, who's really suffering by the loss of fans, because I think he feeds on that.
Yeah.
And he feeds on being that people pleaser that you said about, and he wants to represent the fans and he wants to do sort of good for the football club. And I think he's missing that in a very sterilised environment. So, yeah, I fear for him a little bit. Maybe it's confidence. Again, I fear whether a major injury may have sort of plighted him and squandered his capabilities a little bit. But only time will tell, and it's certainly not fair to write him off. He's done. It's been a meteoric rise, really. He came in as his fourth choice centre back, so you can't forget that aspect of it. But for me, I think from 2 weeks that we've had so far, that's obviously been an area that Norwich City have concern about.
Just on Godfrey, I suppose Godfrey as a pair, really, because I think when you talk about one of them, ultimately they're playing as a partnership, and I think you have to take them in tandem. And I spoke about this probably about a week or two ago now on My Football Writer, and actually both those players' strengths and weaknesses, like you said, are very sort of out there in the open. We know what Godfrey's good at, and we know what, and vice versa, so sort of, you know, their strengths and weaknesses. And I think maybe this is a bit more of a wider issue, but for me, it's just about finding that balance, and hopefully Ben Gibson provides it, because look, Godfrey's really good in terms of bringing the ball out. He's got fairly good distribution, you know, in terms of those diagonals, which we see in play, which I suppose we might maybe not, that might take a facet of his game out if he is shifted that to that right-hand side, although technically he should still be able to do it to the opposite side. But it'll be interesting to see sort of how maybe Godfrey's game changes alongside, all right, somebody who hasn't played for the best part of 2 years, but a more experienced in at a higher level of Ben Gibson. Because I don't think Godfrey and Zimmermann are the ideal partnership for either of them, because Godfrey, in my opinion, needs that leader. He needs that figure who's been there and done it. He's a young lad trying to learn the game. And I think Zimmermann, in a weird sense, is probably the same, because like you say, his career up to Norwich had been in the lower leagues of German football and hadn't ever really been playing at this level. You talked about Zimmermann's, how he feeds off the crowd. And I wonder if the fact that he didn't obviously have that many fans at Borussia Dortmund too, whether actually that is a major factor in him taking his game to the next level, being a title winning centre half and getting praise from from Arsene Wenger as we all know he did. But that Zimmermann was brought in as our fourth choice centre back, and I don't think there was ever really much expectation. I think one major issue I have, probably speaking about a number of players here, is talking about past glories and talking about, well, Zimmermann was so good in the 2018-19 campaign. Well, everybody was. We could have had any member of that squad brought in that season, and the culture and the camaraderie, if you like, in that cohort was just so strong and so positive, and Farkas should take a lot of credit for that. But that's probably one of my main bugs is talking about the title winning season, because, you know, it's getting on to sort of nearly 2 years now since that campaign, and we've seen too many disappointing performances from players like Zimmermann. And I completely agree, it's surely got to be a matter of time until Ben Gibson is introduced. I gave Zimmermann the benefit of the doubt, because I always feel like he is the profile of Zimmermann. He needs a few games to get going, because all of a sudden, if he's not quite 100%, his touch isn't there. He's a little bit slow, and as we say, the Titanic comment which I made to Alfie during the game about it, and probably a little bit harsh, but yeah, I completely agree. It's got to be a matter of time until Gibson is introduced.
Yeah, I think what I what I would say, obviously Godfrey and Zimmerman were the partnership that Norwich played with sort of at the back end of the Championship season. They still conceded a lot of goals, and that's clearly a structural issue. It's not to blame them two in particular, but I would sort of caveat it by saying I don't think one player coming into the fence in Ben Gibson is going to radically change the way Norwich City defend. I don't think they're going to magically stop conceding goals. I think if you want a high-profile example, look at Thiago Silva, drop straight into Chelsea's defence and they can see 3 goals. So he's not the Messiah, and he's not going to come in and they're going to suddenly be this side that keep load of clean sheets, because
it's not the way we play, is it? No.
Exactly. Having the fullbacks push on, you are going to leave the centre-backs exposed. That is the part of the trade-off, I guess, between having sort of marauding fullbacks. You do leave yourself exposed to counter-attacks. So Ben Gibson coming in isn't going to stop Norwich City conceding goals, but you would hope that it does improve the way they defend individually and sort of one-on-one, because that for me is where sort of Zimmerman's been caught out, and particularly in the Preston game. I mean, Shawnee Maguire, who is probably a foot and a half smaller than Christoph Zimmerman, he really struggled to contend with him, and that's kind of been an issue for him probably since he joined Norwich. That physically, if you engage him in a battle, I mean, that's chalk and cheese for him. It's happy days. But if you get someone who's a bit more mobile and perhaps wants to run beyond and wants to get the ball to feet, then that's not necessarily best suited to him.
I guess if we kind of look past Bournemouth now and to the kind of events that I guess overshadowed the performance, and that is the, I guess, Todd Cantwell and Emi Buendia situation that we find ourselves in. Now, I just kind of wanted to ask, again, and I don't mind, whoever wants to kind of take this one first, but do you feel like Farke was publicly right to criticise both of them the way he did in his post-match press conference, I guess?
I mean, I'll just quickly jump in. I think I saw a brilliant tweet from somebody. I think it was Adam Brandon, basically saying, well, where is this criticism for the sort of aforementioned Godfrey and Zimmerman? We can talk about Cantwell's lack of influence that Farke raised, and we can talk about similar criticisms that were aimed at Buendia during the Premier League season, but I can't ever really remember Godfrey and Zimmerman being called out. Let me get my words out of my mouth. That much. So I think that's what I'd say, and I'll let Connor sort of take the rest of that.
It's incredibly difficult without knowing two sides to the story. Knowing both sides, it's hard to say sort of who's right and who's wrong. What I would say is I don't think anyone comes out as a winner, and I think all it probably has done is raise more questions about the overall situation and happiness of the group as a whole. Because if you're looking across, and again, the fact that the transfer window is overhanging the start of the season doesn't help, but if I'm, I don't know, if I'm Lucas Rook, for example, and I'm looking across and I've got Emi Buendia and Todd Cantwell, and you're looking at the guys going, well, yes, you've got loads of quality, but are you going to be here in 2 weeks? That's an incredibly uncertain thing for any club. And I agree with his point that if the mentality isn't right in training, that they don't get selected. That's the way a team gets picked. So, because if you're a Jordan Hugill or you're a Josh Martin or a Marco Stiepermann and you're giving your all every day in training, 100%, and then you're told, actually, you're not going to be in the squad because here are two guys that have vividly and noticeably performed at a lower standard to you every day, but they're in the matchday squad because they're Todd Cantwell and Emi Buendia, then you're setting a dangerous precedent about who you allow into your squad and the standards that you set within your group. So I think from that perspective, it's very difficult to argue with him because ultimately he's the head coach and he is not there to be their friend. He's there to win football matches for Norwich City, and he has to do that in the best way he sees fit, and you only do that with committed players. On the flip side, do I think he went a bit too far with his comments? Yes. I think the centre-backs line is unhelpful, and I think it is increasingly difficult to see, particularly with Todd Cantwell, who I think he was stronger on than Emi Buendia. It's increasingly difficult to see how Todd Cantwell remains a Norwich City player outside this window because increasingly that looks like a relationship that is beginning to get beyond repair.
I guess to kind of add to that, I think I remember a couple of instances with those two players, and I guess it depends if you look into it too much. But I remember the tail end or kind of middle of last season. I remember Emi Buendia getting quite a lot of public stick from Daniel Farke about his attitude and kind of mentality, and I guess the way he was playing. And I think it was a very weird press conference where he kind of went into his stats and what he hasn't done, and likewise, I remember. I think the season before that, when we went up, it was very publicly known, and Webber come out a couple of times about Todd Cantwell and his negotiations with his new contract. And do you feel like it's one of those kind of relationships where it is completely different behind scenes and behind the kind of scenes at Colney, and it is almost like it was never meant to kind of, I guess these players were always going to leave eventually. Do you feel like that kind of relationship's always been there?
Yeah, possibly. I know that there was some, and you said Webber was quite public in terms of the contract negotiations with Todd, and I wonder how much of that sort of ill feeling has sort of spilled over. And I get it, because Todd, at least to me, and this is only meeting him a couple of times and speaking to him comes as a couple of, he's a lovely guy. I get the impression that he's very sensitive. He wants to be loved. And I don't think that he's necessarily always felt that love, by whether that's by supporters or by certain people in the club. And I really feel like he does need that. Equally, you have to earn that, and there is a standard to set. And equally, you have to learn that just because someone's critiquing your game or wants to try and push you on or is giving you a bit of tough love, that's not always personal criticism. And so as a young player, it's a difficult trade-off to have. Equally, and it's an incredibly difficult situation to be in for all parties. But if I'm Todd Cantwell, I read those comments and him talking about the statistics and how Grant Hanley and Christoph Zimmermann will get more assists, and it would be difficult not to be upset by those from someone that you would hope would be on your side, essentially. And I think Daniel Farke is. But for me, it kind of stems from Todd perhaps not feeling he's as loved as perhaps maybe he should be. And look, there is an arrogance about Cantwell and Buendia. They wouldn't be creative midfielders without it. They kind of need it. Look at James Maddison, exactly in the same boat. They kind of need that edge to their game to make them sort of special, I guess, and make them the creators that they are. But equally, there has to be a foot in the ground. They have to keep their feet on the ground. They have to stay grounded. And we hear a lot the phrase, and we've heard it from Stuart Webber, invest in the root, not the fruit, right? And when these players do blossom into fruit, they need to remember who nurtured them and who sort of grew them, and actually who allowed them to make mistakes. Norwich have allowed Todd Cantwell and Emi Buendia to make mistakes and have kept including them because they want them to improve, not just for the benefit of Norwich City. Ultimately, that's the priority, but also as individuals as well, because Norwich City's model is predicated on the idea that they sell these players for top money. So they need them to develop in that sort of way. But if you develop into a lovely, crunchy, nice, delicious apple, but you're still attached to your tree, ultimately you need to feed into the wider part of the process, and it can't be about you. Equally, they're young men, and I understand that when that speculation comes in, when you get linked with a club the size of Leeds United, with the allure of the Premier League, having just spent a year in the Premier League and scored the second highest amount of goals as a Norwich City player, I can understand why your head would still be there and why you think you deserve to be there. But equally, you have to look at Max Aarons and say he's the role model. He's the guy that has shown the right attitude, that has shown the right application, and hasn't allowed his head to get turned. But they're young men. We're talking about lots of money. We're talking about their ambition as well. So without hearing their side of the story, it's difficult to sort of pass judgment fully. I just feel incredibly sad about the whole situation, because Todd Cantwell's a Durham lad. He's been at Norwich since he was a very young kid. He's come through the system. He's a Norfolk boy. Regardless of what people say, he does love the club. And it would be very, very, very sad if it ended sourly for him at this football club. And I don't think it's the way he, or the way that supporters or Daniel Farke or Stuart Webber would want that particular episode to end. And it would be very sad if that was the case.
There's some really interesting points in there. And in terms of, I've always felt that maybe the best thing for all parties would be to press the reset button this season. And I don't really feel like that's quite happened to I'm never going to expect a complete turnover, of course, but I don't necessarily think that's happened to the degree that I would have liked. I think it, to me, feels like the end of a cycle, and it feels like, in all honesty, players like Todd, their time is up. Hopefully, we can still keep Ben and Max, and whilst that, the speculation surrounding Max seems to have died down, I think he probably now, with the caliber of club that we're talking about, is always going to be there or thereabouts in that speculation. So time will tell with that. I mean, I think the really interesting thing is Todd's relationship with the club, and you sort of mentioned it there, that actually from Fiasco and probably from Norwich fans in general, I think we are more maybe harsh of our criticism with young players who have grown up in the county and come through with through the system. I think there's a lot of parallels with the Murphy twins, in all honesty, in terms of not only sort of positionally, but Norwich fans have never really had that Norwich fan comfort. Not that I can remember anyway. I mean, we're all fairly young around here, but I'm sure a few of the older fans probably can remember one or two. But I can't ever remember that boyhood player coming through and playing for his club, because I'm sure Todd does love the club, like you said, but ultimately, let's not beat around the bush. He's not a Norwich fan. He doesn't have that personal emotion per se to the club as us three do as Norwich fans. So I always I feel like it's very similar to the Murphy situation, and actually maybe us as fans are more harsh with our criticism, but I don't think any of that is unjustified. I think Todd has been a good player for us in the past season, and he has, in terms of his value and the pedestal, he's higher up as he was before, even before he signed that contract. And look, Todd scored some good goals against some big teams, but where was he when it really mattered? And as a fan, that's what I would say. Before, look, we don't know what goes on behind the club, and let's not speculate, but it's a shame, and it's not a nice way for it to all end. But I think, in my opinion, it's the end of a cycle, and maybe it's just best for us all to move on. And he'll get a decent move probably to Leeds if that does go through. But the grass isn't always greener, and I think, maybe it's just that right time now.
I think the biggest problem for me, and the biggest disappointment for me out of this whole kind of process, if you like, is that I think when you take things so personally, or so personally publicly, that could only be a negative in the way that not only does it obviously make the player look bad, but like you mentioned earlier, Connor, why, if you're Todd Cantwell now, would you want to be like, yeah, you know what, I'm going to stay here and stick this out when you've publicly criticised me to everyone and made me, to the fans, paint me out in a
There's
bad
got to be a
light.
reason for that, right? Unless it's just sort of like Fiasco post game, not really like, we all know how emotions run high after a game, and all of a sudden, bam, you're asked about probably one of your highest valued players. It might have just been a slip of the tongue and he missed it. But at the same time, I doubt Fiasco says anything like that without a reason, in all honesty.
I think that's the problem for me,
speculation,
though.
But
it was so unprofessional in the way that it was done. It was like there was so many more questions that led on from that. And if you're a Leeds United now and you're sitting there thinking, "Well, we lodged a £20 million bid," and he's saying that, they want to get him out. Let's go lower, and that only drives the price down, in my opinion. And that's going to not only have a negative impact on us, because we're going to be more than likely to lose a player that we probably weren't predicting to lose, or hadn't predicted to replace in that retrospect. But now clubs are going to come in and expect to pay potentially less, because they know that there's that conflict in the club that they want to get rid of. And I think that's the downside for me, is that I feel like no one has won from those comments being made. Yeah. But I mean, Con, I don't know if you want to touch on that, or I don't know if you want to say anything, but feel free to go ahead.
Yeah, I think what I would add is, well, obviously this is all hypothetical anyway, because as it stands, there have been no bids lodged for Todd Cantwell, and discussions are completely different to bids. And we've seen sort of stuff escalate today with Leeds being in for that Bayern Munich midfielder. Now for me, they're not going to sign both of them. So yeah. At the end of the day, if Todd's to move on, then they need to find a buyer, and they need to find one within the next 2 weeks. And I would imagine that if one of them was if someone was interested in Todd, that perhaps that interest would have been made clear to Norwich before 2 weeks before the deadline, which is what I would caveat it with. And this is where Norwich have to be incredibly careful, because it's a very sort of high risk game of poker that Daniel Farke's playing, because these are two players incredibly talented. If you sell both and then maybe don't replace them because of the time left in the window, then fans are going to be left scratching their heads and going, well, hang on a second, you told us 3 weeks ago that it was going to be a sort of promotion charge that you're mounting. So your actions aren't adding up with your words. And that's a difficult sort of gap to bridge in terms of trust and in terms of supporters' morale. So there's that element to it as well. But equally, this isn't the first time that Norwich City and a major figure has sort of spoken out against Todd Cantwell. We had Stuart Webber's comments after the Brighton game. Of course, we've had Daniel Farke's criticism of Emi Buendia as well. And equally, it's worth noting and worth adding that Daniel Farke has tried sort of praising them, and he has tried that approach, and maybe he hasn't seen the response that he wanted to get. And so now he's tried to be a bit more blunt. And this could work out brilliantly. If both players come in against Derby, both score a goal and Norwich win 2-0, then Daniel Farke's a genius and no one questions his man management, right? So that's football. But there is a difficulty that this game of poker he's playing doesn't pay off. And Norwich don't sell either of them. And Daniel Farke isn't happy with either of them, and they're not happy to be here. And in that situation, again, there's no winner because they're not turning up every week. Norwich are considerably weaker. They haven't been able to get a replacement. They're lumbered with 2 players that don't really want to play for the head coach, don't really want to be at the club. That's in no one's interest. And just on Todd's perspective, in terms of any sort of perceived Premier League interest and any noise that is out there, as a young man, football's a short career. He will see it as an opportunity to better himself, and I think he does feel admiration. He does feel gratitude for the club, but again, it's that loved element. I don't think he necessarily feels loved in the same way that perhaps Max Aarons or Emi Buendia is. I don't think he feels that's the case, and a lot of water has sort of gone under that bridge, of course, with the fans' criticism, and he's spoken out publicly about how much that hurt him. So I think if an opportunity did arise, I think he'd want to prove that he's not just a Norfolk boy who plays for his hometown club. I think he'd want to push on and be a bit more than that. And you have to praise his ambition. And you could totally understand if he was trying to force a move back to the Premier League. It's a short career. He wants to better himself, better money, better opposition, a better quality of players around him. You don't know where Norwich are going to be in a year. So it's an incredibly complex situation. Only time will tell if it gets played out publicly. But as things stand, I would be absolutely shocked if Todd Cantwell was a Norwich City player come October the 16th.
In terms of I completely get, something me and Alfie talk about. We never really want to hold players back, and I completely agree. Like, it is a short career, and it's something that we spoke about quite a lot previously, actually, on this podcast. In terms of, we're not these type of Norwich fans that are like, oh, you've signed a 3-year contract, blah blah blah. He signed a 3-year contract to protect his value, like not because he's going to be here for 3 years. Like, that's the only reason. So I completely agree that I don't think anybody wants to hold these players back. And in all honesty, it's no benefit of the club to hold them back. We know how Norwich work in terms of their self-sufficient standing, and actually that Todd, the reason we developed Todd and we signed Emi, Stuart Webber has admitted it himself. He signed Emi Buendia to make money. Like, he said it in I think it was the Beautiful Game podcast. He was like, he went to the finances guy and was like, I know you haven't got any much more transfer budget for me, but I've got an opportunity to make money here with Emi Buendia. And nobody ever expects Cantwell and Buendia to finish their careers here. One thing I'd say about feeling loved and that compassion that evidently he wants and the way he wants to be managed, I'm not entirely sure Leeds United is the place, especially when Ellen Road is full of 40,000 fans. If he thinks Norwich is a little bit maybe harsh with the critics, I don't think Yorkshire's going to be too much better. In honesty, I think it might only exacerbate issues. But it is all hypothetical, and time will tell in terms of where Buendia and Todd are playing their football sort of post window. But I agree, it's not a great situation for anybody to be in, and it will be interesting to see how it all plays out, because at the moment it doesn't look like Farke's probably made the best call in those comments either, does it?
Now, I know you kind of alluded to it a moment ago, Connor, but I guess the next kind of thing I wanted to move to is with the potential of, Emi, Todd, and let's not, forget that this time last week or a couple of days ago, we're talking about, almost a deal looking set for Max Aarons to leave. Obviously, with Barcelona signing Dest in the last couple of days, or rumored to, it hasn't been confirmed yet, obviously very into kind of deep negotiations. It's still not off the cards that we might not lose 3 of our assets, in the next 2 weeks of the window. So do you feel like at this present time, we should be in a position where we should proactively be looking to cover these positions? Or do you feel like if all three of these players to leave, or, you know, whether that be Emmy or Todd, that we have sufficient cover in those areas? I mean, what do you guys think?
Um, it's difficult. I think they probably need to replace Buendia more than Cantwell. If I'm completely honest, I think Buendia is a pretty unique case, and he would be very difficult to replace. And look, they'll have shortlists, they'll have ideas and scenarios mapped out of players that they would go for, and you know, that's the job of a sporting director. It's contingency planning, and it's planning for 3 years, 4 years down the line. So when Emi Buendia goes, they'll have an idea of who they want, and that's the job of the recruitment department to flag up those players and for Norwich to scout them in depth. So I've no doubt they'd have that. For me, they would only delve into the market again if it was Max Aarons who left, because clearly that would leave a glaring hole at right back, with Sam Byram out long term and Ballymumba as well. And as I said there, Buendia, I think they're the two for me that they would desperately have to replace. I think Godfrey, you've probably got enough coverage at centre back if he did depart, and I don't think he will. But I also don't think we'll see more than one more depart, for the reason that I said earlier, because you can't come out and say that you're ambitious and you want to return at the first time of asking, and you don't need to sell, only to then sell 3 or 4 of those. Doesn't match up. It's like doing a dot-to-dot puzzle and just completely messing it up. It doesn't make sense. And I don't think they will, because there's a balance to be struck here, because they can't sell those players and leave themselves worse competitively if they are truthful in what they say, and I believe they are, in terms of trying to get back to the Premier League. So that's kind of the balance they have to strike. And at this stage of the window, agents get desperate, and I think we've you know been told that might necessarily be the case at the moment. That certain links are emerging because agents are beginning to sort of scramble, trying to get those players out of respective clubs, not just at Norwich, elsewhere as well. And ultimately, that's their job, to get sort of the best deal for their clientele. So certainly no blame on my part for that. But it's going to be an interesting 2 weeks. I'm with Daniel Farker. I'll be pleased when the thing's closed, to be honest, and Norwich have a bit of certainty, because it's difficult at the moment to plan for anything when you don't know what your squad's going to look like in 2 weeks' time. What I would add is, I think the blow to obviously fans returning to Carrow Road and it being a possibility for 5-6 more months that we don't see supporters in, that will really sort of ramp up the need for a player sale at some point, not necessarily this window, not necessarily January, but certainly in the future, because there's going to be a significant sort of financial hole to fill. So there is going to be a player sale down the line. Every club's a selling club. Norwich will sell players, Liverpool will sell players. They will to the end of time, and that's the nature of it. For me, it's about how you recruit, and I think they'll have names on a list at Colney ready to go. Should certainly Buendia and Aarons depart, I think they'd be forced to dip into the market again.
I think, like, in terms of replacing Emmy and Todd, I don't know if you two agree here, but the situation, if they were both to be sold, in terms of replacing them, I think the situation has been exacerbated by obviously Dow's injury, because ultimately you got Placata and O'Neill currently sort of occupying those positions in terms of out wide. But I think you can almost take the 3 positions as tandem, because whilst like Emmy and Todd have played out wide, we've seen with Todd playing centrally in recent. Well, I think once Dow came off, Todd played centrally, so they evidently know that these players can play in the middle. But I just wonder if Dow's injury has just maybe made things worse, because I personally would like to see more of Josh Martin. It doesn't make sense for me, it's a little bit similar for me, but actually Ballymum's a little bit different, because obviously how short he's been in the building. But I'd like to see Martin be given a chance if one of these was sold. But I think maybe both of them makes it a little bit more problematic, because like you say, all of a sudden Dow's out injured, Stephenman hasn't been involved, Martin hasn't really, I don't think he's set foot on the pitch yet this season, has he? So it'll be interesting to see what they do in that department, because ultimately in January Dow will probably be back and Dow will be thinking, well, you know, where's my opportunity coming now if they go out and make a sort of statement signing, if you like to use an overused cliche. But it'll be interesting to see how they deal with that. I completely agree, because I'm sure we're all in agreement that Dow's injury is a massive blow for Norwich's promotion hopes. In all honesty, that's half the season gone, isn't it? And then you're talking about a player having to get back into fitness and get back into that team in the system. And, I'm not entirely sure what I'll do, but I completely agree. I think if both of them go, then we need definitely one more placement for sure.
Okay, so if we kind of take a wider look to the future and what's next for us, obviously, if we're talking about the kind of more immediate future, we've got Derby on Sky this weekend. But if we kind of look more kind of general, look at what's coming up, how do you feel? Obviously, we've started with 1 win, 1 draw, 1 loss. You couldn't get kind of more balance than that, I suppose. But are there any kind of glaring concerns for you guys from what you've seen in the first couple of games? Likewise, are there any, I guess, real positives that you're kind of glad to see? Obviously, bouncing, kind of coming down from the Premier League, it's always usually tough to kind of get running. We've seen that quite a few times with Norwich. So I'd like to maybe come to you, Connor, first. Do you feel like, is there any concerns that you've seen from the opening games which you really feel like we need to iron out in order to kind of be successful this season?
Yeah, plenty. And it's about making sure, as I said before, that those particular things don't become trends. So, and again, some of them are really small in terms of individual players and their positioning. So Quintilla starting really deep, as I mentioned. Placheta sort of running into the space. That there was an incident in the second half on Sunday where Hernandez sort of had a defender one-on-one and Placheta came and took that space. And so essentially he was forced back and Norwich had to rebuild. So subtle things like that to more structural issues like how Norwich defend against the ball, how they are in transition. There was still plenty of sort of counter-attacking moments, and I felt they were quite slow in transition again, and that was a sort of really pertinent issue last year. But there are plenty of positives as well. Ollie Skip, we've mentioned him. He looks excellent. If they can continue to develop him and accept in a similar way that we've spoken about that there will be mistakes, then I think as long as he can continue his consistency, that Norwich have a real good player there on their hands. Equally, that performance on Sunday in the second half, that needs to become more consistent as well. So for me, it feels like they've got the bits of the jigsaw there, and some again are kind of uncertain about how they fit in at the moment because of the transfer window, and a lot of those answers will be resolved. Equally, I don't think it's as simple as the transfer window shuts. Right, here are all the best players; they're all happy and committed. That's not the case. For me, it's fitting it together into a cohesive puzzle. But the one thing Norwich City and Daniel Farke don't have at the moment is time, because of what we spoke about, the expectation. And Daniel Farke needs to get this right fairly quickly, because if he doesn't, then there's going to be questions sort of thrown in his direction about his future. So it's a difficult one. It's going to be complex. Yes, I have concerns. I have plenty of them. But equally, it's important that they don't just occupy your focus, because there are plenty of stuff that Norwich City have and did do very well against Bournemouth as well. And it's been, as you say, a real mixed bag of both performances and results so far. So we need to see what Norwich City is. The consistent Norwich City is the Norwich City that we see more often than not. And hopefully it's more in the second half against Bournemouth with significant tweaks than against Preston or against Huddersfield.
I think like the context point in terms of taking this the situation Norwich find themselves in at the moment, and particularly talking about Bournemouth, is really important, because like you say, there are so many things going on, and besides the transfer speculation, just the world that we find ourselves in at the moment. So I'm trying not to be too maybe anxious, because like you say, we have seen Norwich make poor starts before and be better for it. But I guess the thing that I'm really trying not to do is trying to I'm holding myself back in terms of making out that Norwich's best player and Norwich's answer to all their issues is on the bench. That I know I talked about Gibson being a player that I'd like to come in, but I'm trying really hard to not be like, well, they need to get Vrancic in, they need to get Eder in, they need to get so and so playing before they can even start doing it. I think because Norwich, we're all guilty of it, aren't we? And of saying that, the answer to all your issues is on the bench. Well, actually, I completely agree. I think there's more maybe structural issues and approaches to game that they need to work out. And I think that was probably why I was a little bit perplexed as to why they made a sudden shift to the 4-3-3 or 4-1-4-1. I think it's a system I like, and it's a system that I've always felt suits Norwich. But like I say, playing two not necessarily aggressive players in Rupp and McLean in front of Skip, but Vrancic gets us a lot, but you are again looking at that and going, well, you need a Mario, and I don't think Mario is the answer, because at the stage he's at in his career and his contractual situation and his lack of involvement, for him to suddenly turn out to be, the player that Farke builds his side around, I think is probably a little bit far-fetched. But I think it is important to maybe just to stay calm. But I completely agree. There are a lot of weaknesses and areas of improvement that Norwich need to make. And I think, like I said, I'm just trying to reserve my decision to say that the answer is on the bench, I think.
I guess to kind of ask one last question, just before a kind of brief touch on Derby coming up this weekend. And it's we kind of alluded to it a lot, and Norwich fans do this a lot since we've obviously got promoted, is, we started, poor. We only won 1 in 6 games the year we went up. What point are we kind of setting in our minds where we go, all right, by this point, that's really where we should be showing good signs of progression this season? What point do you feel like that is for you?
10 games. I think at 10 games, you get a rough look at where you're going to be in the table, roughly, with a few exceptions. I've kind of got a new phrase that I'm adopting this year, which is certainly in the opening 10 games, which is comments, not conclusions. I think that's an important one to take. You can't say, well, Norwich lost at Bournemouth, so they're not going to finish in the top 2. That's an unrealistic sort of outlook to take based on one performance, because I think a lot in a 10-game trend can go for or against you. For example, Reading have won the opening 3 games. That I don't necessarily think that means Reading are going to win the league. Derby have lost their first 3 games. I definitely don't think that means that Derby County are going to get relegated. So you have to kind of be a bit measured and a bit in the middle. But 10 games for me is a significant chunk where you start to see trends form. And whilst things might not necessarily be completely in place by then, you would certainly hope that there is significant structural improvements and decent patterns of play that you can look at it and go, right, you can see that they're moving in the right direction. For me, that's probably the marker that I set in terms of really judging this Norwich City side at the moment. That said, if they do get some really bad results and they fail to pick up wins in the coming weeks, then that expectation and that pressure is only going to get sort of ramped up. So, it's a difficult one, but the 10-game marker for me, I think, is significant.
I was initially going to say, if we're still having maybe similar conversations in November, then I'd probably be, the alarm bells would be ringing. I'm not sure if that probably coincides with your 10-game marker, but that sounds about right in terms of where Norwich would be. Yeah, I agree, to be honest. That's what I'll say.
In terms of Derby, then, looking ahead to that very briefly, is it fair to say that when Hanley is back, it will be Zimmerman and Hanley on each wing? Is that what's going to happen now? I guess to kind of look ahead, are we expecting this 4-1-4-1 to continue, or are we expecting to kind of revert back to a 4-2-3-1? How do you kind of feel like we're going to play?
I mean, just to nip in there, like if Todd and Nemi aren't back, I struggle to see how it will be much different. I think the thing that I'd like to say is I would like to see a bit more of a progressive ball player in there alongside somebody who provides that energetic approach to games like Rupp and McLean do. And like I say, I don't want to say that Vrancic is the answer to all Norwich's issues, but the finger does point towards him in terms of if you're looking for somebody who can play through the thirds, Leitner's out of the picture. I'm not really entirely convinced that Tribal fits into that mould either. And like I say, he's nowhere near it either. So I think I would expect to see a 4-1-4-1. I'm not sure if you agree, Connor, but Stiepermann, again, doesn't really look like he's anywhere near it again. I don't think he's been subject to the exact same treatment as Leitner and Tribal, but I struggle to see a way into the side for him currently. So I would expect to see a 4-1-4-1, but it's hard to say that McLean deserves to start after that performance, surely. I think Norwich do need to have a bit more progression. They need more balance. You can't, you're playing 2 wingers and 2 defensive midfielders. Well, who's going to pick up the ball in the spaces and on the turn that we know Emmy, Todd, even somebody like Kieran Dow, who unfortunately won't be available, is able to do. And I think if Norwich maybe are thinking, well, if we sell Todd and we sell Emmy, maybe we go for a 4-1-4-1. Ultimately, we're not even talking about necessarily directly replacing Todd and Emmy. You're going to need players to fit that system, and I think they need somebody who has more technical competence if Leitner's ostracised and he isn't anywhere near it, because ultimately you're not going to win. You're not going to get out of this league with Rupp and McLean as your creative number 8. So I don't really see how anyone could argue with that. Like it's just not going to happen. So 4-1, 4-1, I'd expect to see, and maybe more long term if that's the plan. Then there probably needs to be certain personnel recruited, in my opinion.
I would agree. I would expect a similar base formation in terms of how Norwich approach it. So 4-1, 4-1, 4-3-3, however you perceive it. I agree. I think we'll see Vrancic start, but I think in order for Vrancic to start, they need to get more mobility around him. So for me, that means that Lucas Rupp retains his place, and you're right. I think Kenny McLean drops out because I didn't really feel like he offered too much at Dean Court, if I'm being completely honest. And I kind of think that some of the criticism sort of aimed towards him is quite harsh at times, but I get it because in 2.5 years of watching Kenny McLean, I can't really tell you what sort of midfielder he is. So that is a problem. So I think we'll see Vrancic alongside Rupp with Skip holding. Equally, if it was me, I would probably go for the three at the back that we saw at the second half against Bournemouth. Push Buendia to the left wing back. Placheta drops out and welcome Ben Gibson into that back line with Vrancic coming in midfield. And I think that with Gibson's more vertical passes that Daniel Farke's spoken about, coupled with Mario Vrancic's sort of incisive quality on the ball, I think you've got options there to unlock a defence. So I would be intrigued by that system, particularly if they could get a physical presence. I think it would probably be Ida, but Hugo would definitely be interesting with Quintia's left foot. Then I think that makes the crossing situation a bit more viable. So I would expect a 4-1, 4-1, but I would not be surprised if we saw a free at the back, or what happened at Bournemouth, which is Norwich start with that formation and then switch to a free at the back. That wouldn't surprise me.
Just quickly, I'm like I say, I haven't really been in the loop in terms of what's been said media-wise. I've been relying on Alfie to sort of filter me through messages in the past day or so. But did I read that you said that the club are now viewing Vrancic as a 10? Is that right? And just quickly, because I can't. Can you see Vrancic playing in a 10 as a 4-2-3-1, or do you think that point maybe is a bit more as a 4-3-3, but 10 as in he's the creative sort of facet of your side, if you know what I mean? Do you get what I'm saying? You know how like Maddison plays a little bit deeper for Leicester. Do you think, all right, he's a 10, by trade, but he's more starting defensively as an 8. Do you see where I'm coming from?
Yeah, I kind of call him. I kind of call it or categorise it as an 8.5. That's kind of how I see it. Yeah, he's certainly put into that number 10 debate now with Marco Stiepermann, with Todd Cantwell, with Kieran Dow, and I think that was a decision made basically because of his lack of physicality and his lack of mobility in the Premier League. And he is someone who possesses immense technical quality. And I kind of think to an extent, he is kind of put on a pedestal by Norwich fans, to an extent. But equally, I get it because he's a player that tries to make things happen, and those players always sort of glow up. And he has, very, like we said, 2 years ago, I know you want to stop talking about it, but he had very good goal contributions. So I kind of get it. And as I said earlier, I think Farke's idea about that double pivot has changed slightly from when he walked into the club about being two very technical players that set the tempo, that set the pace, that assert the philosophy, to now being more protectors and a bit more pragmatic. And I think that's a scarf in the Premier League. And as a result of that, I think they now see Vrancic as that 10 or that 8.5 in a 4-1-4-1. But in order to play him, you need to get legs around him because he is not the most mobile. He's not the best in transition. And you probably do need to almost not build your team around him, but you certainly need to have a midfield that allows him to extract his best qualities. And that for me means having a terrier in Lucas Rupp who will not stop running, and Ollie Skip, who's very progressive on the ball.
What a line. A terrier and Lucas Rupp.
He's and Ollie Skip as well, who I think his progressive passing and his quality on the ball has been a bit overlooked in the opening 2 games, but he has that element to it as well. And I think that midfield setup, to me, looks very balanced as a 3. Yeah. Whether it works in practice, these things are always great on paper. We shall see.
No, I agree. I think if aliens, landed on Earth and they wanted to know about Mario Vrancic and they're asking Norwich fans, it'd be painted as this picture of, somebody who certainly wouldn't be playing for Norwich. He has no weaknesses if you ask Norwich fans. So I think
he'd be dipped head to toe in gold, wouldn't he?
Yeah.
I guess as a final thing then, in terms of score predictions, I know we don't really know, but how do you feel it's going to go? Is it in a long come Norwich? They've lost 3 and they're long come Norwich, or is it more of back to winning ways?
I think it's going to be more difficult than people imagine. I kind of think it's the worst time for Norwich to play Derby because they've just lost 4-0. And if you're Philip Cocu, you're going, what the hell was that? Show me a response. And so if Derby come to Carrow Road and they're motivated and they're G'd up, and look, no doubt in training this week they're going to have worked on their defensive shape and their positioning. So you would be shocked if there wasn't some sort of improvement. I think it's going to be quite similar in terms of Norwich having a lot of the ball and sort of facing a fairly sort of mid to low block, and it's going to be about how they break that down, and Derby are going to try and hit them on the counter with the pace they have. So I can foresee a 2-2 draw, two teams that can't defend, plenty of goals, maybe not the best result for Norwich.
Yeah,
What
I
about you,
agree.
Bill? 2-2.
Yeah.
Wow, 2-2. I'm going to go for a 3-1 Norwich win. Someone's got to be positive here, isn't that right? Well, it's a great place to kind of end things off. Obviously, if you want to I guess, explain to everyone where they can find you and kind of hear more from you, Connor.
Yeah, PinkUn.com is the main place. That's sort of where I reside every day. Yeah, PinkUn.com. Of course, if you're old fashioned and you buy a paper, then the EDP and the Evening News is that's the place to go. I think they're only £1 at the moment, or certainly the EDP is, so bargain.
You're getting commission for this. I hope that you are.
Well, I hope so. I hope so.
Yeah.
Is there a discount code? No.
So we're not
Is this dangerous territory?
No, absolutely not.
No, I'm only messing.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much again for joining us, Connor. I know it's probably been a busy couple of days for you. So it's probably nice to get to bed and just put it all to one side and, leave those nightmares of Bournemouth for later on tonight. But if you want to hear anything from myself and Billy, you can find us on Twitter at The Revere End. And like I say, we release these videos on YouTube and on Spotify pretty much every week as well. So until the next time, thank you very much, Connor, for joining us, and we'll see you later.